You people never fight back. That's why I can do this." Her voice cracked through the courthouse hallway a split second before her hand struck the pregnant woman beside me. The sound was sharp enough that even the walls seemed to flinch. Staff froze. A clerk gasped. My daughter's scream split the air as the HOA president stepped back with the smugness of someone who thought her power made her untouchable. Before I show you the exact moment when the courtroom replayed that slap in front of the entire neighborhood. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. She didn't know the quiet man beside the injured woman had spent years dismantling people who thought rules didn't apply to them. And she didn't know this story wasn't about a slap. It was about exposure. He didn't yell. He didn't lunge. He just steadied his wife with a calmness that didn't match the chaos suddenly unfolding around them. That stillness wasn't shock. It was memory. He'd seen worse in military rooms where misconduct was currency and lies were weapons. Back then, he'd worn a uniform and held authority. Now he carried a rag, a toolbox, and a reputation for being invisible. And invisibility was exactly what would undo her. The hallway reeked of disinfectant and paper dust. Familiar scents in the place where he spent most mornings fixing jammed locks, replacing broken bulbs, and quietly watching the powerful pretend to be untouchable. But today, it was his family standing under those fluorescent lights, his pregnant wife holding her cheek, his little girl trembling, and the woman who hit them trying to straighten her blouse like the strike was nothing more than a social inconvenience. A bailiff rushed back toward them, breathless, having stepped away for a prisoner transfer. He glanced between the stunned faces and the HOA president, clearly unsure where to start. She lifted her chin, already slipping into performance mode, muttering something about a misunderstanding and accidental contact. The words were slippery, polished, the way she handled every neighbor complaint back in the gated community. She used rules as weapons, fines as leverage, and humiliation as recreation. But today she'd done something irreversible. He held his wife gently, checking her cheek, her breathing, the tension in her jaw. She whispered that she was fine, a lie he knew instantly, not because of pain, but because of restraint. Marisa had fought professionally once, lived in cages and rings under lights so bright they wiped out everything but instinct. But pregnancy had changed the stakes. She protected life now, not trophies or belts or crowds, and she'd chosen stillness over reaction. That stillness was strength, but the HOA president mistook it for weakness, like she mistook his quiet job for incompetence. The bailiff asked for statements. Clerks gathered. His daughter clung to him. And all the while, Cynthia Renford, the woman who'd slapped a pregnant mother in a courthouse, stared at him with the irritation of someone inconvenienced by the consequences of her own hand. She didn't know who he used to be. She didn't know what he still remembered, and she certainly didn't know that the corridor camera pointed directly at her. He stepped aside only long enough to make sure the camera above the elevator bank had a clear line of sight. He knew the lens. He cleaned it weekly. He knew the server it fed into, the rotation cycle, the preservation rules, and exactly how to file the right kind of request before footage expired. Not because he wanted revenge, because he understood systems. He'd once spent years collecting evidence against officers who thought their badges made them gods. He recognized the same arrogance in Cynthia now, cracked open by a moment of impulse she could never take back. The bailiff asked if he wanted to press charges. He glanced at Marisa, who straightened with a steadiness that hid her shaking legs. She nodded. He said yes. A deputy clerk hurried forward, eyes wide. "I saw the angle," he whispered, not out of favoritism, but out of shock. "File the footage request today. The server resets every 48 hours. Cynthia's head snapped toward them. "There's no need for that," she said quickly, too quickly. It was a misunderstanding. His calm deepened. Misunderstanding was what people called violence when they thought they were safe from accountability. He guided his wife and daughter into the small corner of the hallway where benches lined the wall. He'd spent years walking by that bench with mop buckets and maintenance reports, unseen. Now he sat there like a sentinel, watching Cynthia pace, watching her smooth her hair, watching her lie through her teeth to anyone who'd listen. Contrarian snapback settled into his chest like a weight. He wasn't scared of her position. He wasn't intimidated by her power. He'd spent too long around people who hid behind titles to think a presidency of a homeowners association meant anything in a courtroom. Emotional grounding washed through him as he looked at his daughter curled against his side. He thought of the nights he'd promised her this new life was quieter, safer, easier than the world he'd left behind. He thought of the sacrifices Marissa made every day, putting down gloves, cages, and crowds for bedtime stories and prenatal vitamins. He thought about how hard they'd fought for peace, and he knew instantly that the peace wasn't broken. This moment wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Cynthia hadn't just hit his wife, she'd triggered the part of him he'd buried, the part built to gather evidence, build cases, and take the arrogant apart piece by piece. He rose when the officer called his name, ready to give a statement. His wife squeezed his hand. His daughter whispered that she was scared. He told her quietly, firmly, that everything was going to be okay, because for the first time in years, he wasn't going to stay invisible. He was going to use the truth the same way she used fear, and let the courtroom decide who deserved power and who deserved consequences. Justice had entered the hallway the moment she raised her hand, and Justice was patient. He stood when the officer gestured him forward, the same quiet resolve from the hallway carrying him into the small interview room beside the clerk's counter. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, and his daughter's soft sniffles echoed faintly through the half-closed door. He didn't look back. Marissa had their girl in her arms, steadying her breathing, calming her with the reassuring firmness only she could muster. He focused solely on the task in front of him, the first step in building the case. The deputy asked him to recount the sequence of events. He spoke plainly, clearly, without dramatizing or minimizing anything. He explained the hearing, Cynthia's escalating hostility, her false accusations, and the moment she stepped forward in the hallway and struck his pregnant wife across the face. He didn't embellish. He didn't insert emotion. He gave the facts the way he'd once given sworn statements in military investigations, aware that precision carried more weight than anger ever could. When the officer paused to write, he studied her expression. She looked surprised by his composure. Most people who reported assaults arrived frantic or furious. He wasn't either. He was controlled, meticulous, and almost too calm for the situation. It wasn't performance, it was discipline. It was the old part of him resurfacing, not the soldier, not the investigator, but the man who knew that justice was a fragile thing that only survived when handled with clean hands. After the statement was taken, the officer assured him the footage request would be logged. He nodded, thanked her, and stepped out to rejoin his family. Marissa's cheek had reddened. The mark wasn't severe, but the message behind it burned deeper than the skin. His daughter clutched his arm tightly. He wrapped them both against his side and walked them slowly toward the lobby, wanting to get them away from the crowd forming around Cynthia. But Cynthia saw him leaving and lifted her voice with practiced indignation. "You're overreacting," she snapped loudly enough for nearby staff to hear. "It was accidental contact. Don't twist this into something it isn't." Her words weren't for him. They were for the witnesses. She needed the narrative to shift quickly before the story spread beyond the hallway. He stopped walking, but didn't turn toward her. He simply called back to the officer, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear, "Please include her second attempt to redefine the assault in your report." A few heads turned. The HOA president stiffened. Her voice faltered for a fraction of a second. The first visible crack. He didn't need to face her. He just guided his family out into the crisp morning air, letting the courthouse doors shut behind them. The sun warmed the concrete steps, but the tension in the air clung like static. Marissa leaned lightly into him, and he offered his arm without a word. His daughter clung to his hand, as though afraid Cynthia might appear behind them again. They reached their car, and he helped Marissa inside carefully. She rested her head back, closing her eyes. Pregnancy made everything heavier, every emotion louder than it looked from the outside. She whispered, "I'm sorry you had to see that." He shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong." She held onto his hand, and for a moment, the weight of the morning lingered in the quiet of the vehicle. He didn't rush them. He didn't start the engine. He let them breathe. When they finally drove away, he didn't turn toward home. He went to the courthouse annex, where public computer terminals sat for filing requests. He knew exactly what needed to be done. Every piece of evidence had to be captured immediately before delays, excuses, and bureaucratic fog set in. The footage request had been logged by the officer, but he wanted a duplicate copy, a formal time-stamped trail of his own to protect them if anything went missing. At the terminal, he typed swiftly. His fingers moved the same way they had years ago when he'd input military case numbers into restricted systems. Now, he was just a maintenance worker using a public terminal, but his understanding of structure, of how evidence traveled, how records got lost, how stories got twisted, had never left him. He printed confirmations, signed the forms, and submitted them across the counter. The clerk recognized him from his job and from the chaos earlier. "I saw part of what happened," she whispered. "If they need witnesses, I'll speak." He thanked her, genuinely. Every witness mattered. Every voice mattered, especially when going up against someone like Cynthia, someone who ran a neighborhood like a miniature dictatorship, who expected compliance, silence, and deference from everyone beneath her. As he turned to leave, the clerk lowered her voice even further. "She's already asking questions about the footage. She wants to know who has access." He felt something in his chest settle, not anxiety, confirmation. Cynthia was already afraid. That meant he was on the right path. He walked out of the building into the cold air, letting the noise of the courthouse fade behind him. He felt grounded, not shaken, because this wasn't chaos. It was the early stage of a process he understood better than almost anyone. He wasn't the man she thought she slapped in front of witnesses. He wasn't fragile, he wasn't powerless, and he wasn't alone. His wife was strong enough to stand in storms she never asked for. His daughter depended on him, and the woman who struck them didn't. Realized she had awakened the investigator he kept buried under a uniform he no longer wore. As he got into the driver's seat, his daughter looked up at him and whispered, "Are we safe?" He squeezed her hand gently. "More than you know," and for the first time that morning, he felt the truth of his own words settle into place. Because he didn't plan on fighting Cynthia with anger, he planned on fighting her with evidence, and evidence never blinked, never forgot, never lied. Subscribe with the bell on. This story is only getting deeper, and trust me, you'll want to see what happens next. The reassurance he gave his daughter in the car stayed with him long after they reached home. But once she was settled and Marisa was resting, he knew he couldn't sit still. He didn't operate that way. Comfort came from action, not waiting. And evidence needed momentum. So after making sure his family was safe inside, he grabbed his worn notebook, slid it into his jacket, and headed back toward the courthouse for the second time that day. Not as a maintenance worker, not as a husband, but as a man who understood how truth unraveled liars when handled correctly. The courthouse felt different now. Earlier, it had been a place of chaos and shock. Now it was quiet, humming with the midday lull. Staff recognized him, the man from the morning incident, but they didn't speak. They offered respectful nods, the kind people give when they've witnessed something unjust and don't yet know how to process it. He nodded back briefly and walked straight toward the media viewing room. He knew the procedure. Footage requests took time to process, but preliminary viewing logs updated before the footage was fully delivered. He logged in using the temporary guest credentials provided to anyone reviewing public recordings. The interface was clunky, slow, and clearly not designed for user-friendliness. But he'd seen worse systems in the past, back when military terminals operated with flickering screens and outdated keyboards. He navigated it with ease. The morning's footage wasn't ready yet, but the motion logs were. He crossed his arms, leaned in, and began reading line by line. The camera facing the hallway had been triggered 13 times in the last 2 weeks, at the exact intervals that matched Cynthia's courthouse visits, more than any HOA president should ever need to make. He wrote down each timestamp into his notebook, careful, neat, steady. Then he noticed something else. Cynthia always visited shortly before specific HOA financial filings appeared in the county system. The pattern wasn't obvious to most. The system stamped filings digitally, not physically. But he'd seen enough cover-ups in the past to recognize a rhythm in someone's attempts to hide their tracks. He wrote the timestamps down, aligning courthouse visits with HOA documents. The lines began forming a pattern Cynthia wouldn't want anyone to see. As he finished, the deputy clerk Jonah walked past the doorway, halted, and stepped back when he recognized him. Jonah leaned in, lowering his voice. "They told me you came back. Everything okay?" He nodded. Just checking logs, making sure the request sticks. Jonah stepped fully inside the room, closing the door halfway. Listen, you probably know this, but she's already tried to request early access to the footage herself. Claims she needed to clarify context. The supervisor denied her. He raised an eyebrow, not surprised. Manipulators always tried to get ahead of the narrative. Jonah scratched his beard. Also, the way you handled everything earlier, you don't seem new to this stuff. He shrugged. He didn't deny it. Jonah didn't need the full story. Just trying to keep things clean. Jonah nodded slowly, understanding more than he said aloud. If you need a statement from staff, or if the prosecutor requests supporting details, I'll help where I can. He appreciated that. Quiet allies were often more powerful than loud ones. Thank you. Jonah lingered another moment, then left. The door shut softly behind him. He spent the next hour cross-referencing timestamps, filing printouts, and mapping out the subtle discrepancies between Cynthia's stated HOA expenditures and her courthouse appearances. Nothing he accessed was classified or private. Everything was publicly accessible, but only if someone knew where to look. Most people didn't. Most people trusted titles more than trails. When he finally stepped out of the viewing room, the hall felt heavier. The kind of heaviness that came from knowing the truth was beginning to take shape. He tucked the notebook into his jacket and moved toward the exit. As he passed through the lobby, he saw Cynthia speaking with a man in a tailored gray suit. Her posture was rigid, irritated, her voice pitched low but sharp. He didn't slow down, but he caught fragments. Overblown situation. Accidental contact. They're trying to twist it. I need you to handle it. The man nodded in a rehearsed, polished manner that signaled professional damage control, probably a PR consultant or an attorney she'd hired privately. She was already fortifying her defenses, which meant she understood the danger. She spotted him passing through the lobby. Her eyes narrowed, her expression twisting with controlled fury. "Are you seriously still here?" she snapped. "Haven't you caused enough disruption for one morning?" He paused just long enough to meet her gaze. "I'm following procedure. You should do the same." Her jaw clenched. She turned back to her consultant, muttering under her breath. He didn't wait for a response. He stepped outside, letting the courthouse doors close behind him. The air was cooler now, a breeze sweeping across the pavement. He inhaled deeply, letting the clarity settle further. The day wasn't over, but the plan was already forming. He walked to his car and sat behind the wheel, flipping open his notebook. Neat columns of timestamps lined the page. The pattern was unmistakable. Cynthia had been using courthouse visits as cover for questionable filings. Whether intentional or sloppy, it didn't matter. The truth was in the numbers. He tapped a page lightly. This notebook had been with him through years of investigations, training sessions, and long nights piecing together stories others wanted buried. He'd sworn he wouldn't need it anymore in this new life, but today proved otherwise. He started the engine, glancing once more at the courthouse in his rearview mirror. Cynthia thought she slapped a powerless man in a hallway. She had no idea she'd struck the one person who knew exactly how to dismantle her, step by patient step, and tomorrow the evidence trail would begin. He drove away from the courthouse with the notebook open on the passenger seat, the pages fluttering slightly with each turn. The pattern he'd uncovered wasn't just suspicious, it was deliberate. Every courthouse visit Cynthia made coincided with HOA filings that later showed up with altered numbers, vague descriptions, or unusual authorizations. It wasn't proof yet, but it was the kind of smoke that usually pointed to a fire, and he knew how to follow smoke. By the time he reached home, the afternoon sun had dipped behind a sheet of pale clouds. His daughter was napping on the couch, curled beneath a blanket, and Marissa was resting in their bedroom, the exhaustion of the day written across her posture, even in sleep. He kissed his wife's forehead gently, checked that she had water nearby, then stepped out quietly to avoid waking her. That protective calm he always carried deepened inside him, not fear, but duty. He set his notebook on the kitchen table and opened his laptop. If the courthouse showed a pattern, the public HOA records would show the rest. Everything he needed was online: budgets, expenditure reports, board meeting minutes, annual summaries. Most people didn't read them. Even fewer understood how to interpret them. But he'd spent years examining field contracts, reimbursement paperwork, and supply audits. These forms were familiar territory. Bureaucracy was a language, and he spoke it fluently. He scrolled through document after document, looking for what most missed: repeated vendor names, identical invoice templates, sudden jumps in consulting fees, or mismatched dates between approvals and disbursements. And there it was, a string of payments all funneled through a contractor that didn't exist in the state registry. The name was official enough to look real, but when he checked it against public records, there was nothing. No license, no physical address, no registered agent. But the payments were real, and they aligned perfectly with Cynthia's courthouse visits. He circled the contractor name in his notebook, writing a quick note beside it. Shell company, fake vendor, personal account mask. There were multiple possibilities, and none of them favored Cynthia. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not excitement, but the careful focus that came whenever a case shifted from suspicion to clarity. Justice wasn't abstract. It was built line by line, timestamp by timestamp, until the truth became undeniable. A faint knock startled him. When he opened the door, he found their neighbor, an older man named Thornton, standing nervously with a stack of envelopes in his hands. "I heard what happened earlier," he said quietly. "Didn't want to bother your family, but you should see this." He invited the man inside and motioned for him to sit. Thornton placed the envelopes on the table, sighing. "I've had issues with her for years. Fines for things that weren't violations. Fees for inspections I never requested. When she found out my late wife handled all the paperwork, it only got worse. I kept these because something never felt right." He opened the envelopes one by one. Each letter was aggressive, threatening, or suspiciously vague. Some demanded payments with no explanations. Others referenced bylaws that didn't exist, and one contained a veiled threat about future penalties if he ever questioned board decisions. Thornton rubbed his face. "I didn't know what to do back then. Didn't think anyone would believe me. But after what she did to your wife, I figured you might." He nodded slowly, the weight of the man's trust sinking in. "These will help. Thank you." He scanned each document with his phone, saving them into a folder he labeled HOA discrepancies. His investigator's instinct stirred again. Patterns like these didn't happen in isolation. Corruption thrived when victims stayed silent. But today, the silence was cracking. When Thornton left, he sat back at the table and compared the letters with the digital filings. The inconsistencies aligned perfectly. Cynthia wasn't just sloppy. She'd built an entire system of intimidation and manipulated billing. The slap in the courthouse hadn't been a moment of impulse. It was the visible edge of a much larger arrogance that had gone unchecked for far too long. A soft voice interrupted his concentration. His daughter stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Is Mom okay?" He picked her up gently, setting her on his lap. "She's resting. She's okay." "Did she get hurt because of me?" she whispered. His chest tightened. "No, none of this is your fault." She leaned into him, and he let the moment settle before carrying her back to the couch. Once she was settled again, he returned to the table. The case wasn't just about an assault anymore. It was about a community trapped under a woman who thought the rules bent to her will, and the only way to break her hold was through undeniable evidence. As evening shadows stretched across the kitchen, he printed the HOA documents, highlighting mismatches and making notes. He kept his actions careful, precise, lawful, just as he'd been trained. His goal wasn't revenge, it was accountability. When Marissa emerged later, moving slowly but steadier than before, she saw the papers across the table. "You've been working," she murmured. He nodded. "There's a lot more going on than the slap." She pulled out a chair and sat beside him. "You think it's connected?" "I know it is." Her gaze softened with understanding. Even without details, she trusted him. Trusted the old instincts she'd seen resurface today. And he felt that trust settle into his spine like armor. He placed one more note into his notebook. The next step: gather more testimonies. The story was expanding, and he needed witnesses to match the pattern. Tomorrow, he would start asking questions. Tonight, he ensured every document was preserved. Every timestamp was logged. Every potential thread was mapped. The victory wouldn't come from force. It would come from exposure, and exposure had already begun. He didn't sleep much that night. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that let thoughts settle into sharper shapes. The evidence pile on the kitchen table felt heavier than paper should. Every highlighted line, every circled date, Every note in his old notebook formed a clear picture of someone who'd been manipulating power with surgical precision. And tomorrow meant one thing. He needed more voices, more stories, more people willing to step out of the shadows Cynthia had forced them into. Morning sunlight stretched across the table when he sat down again, sipping lukewarm coffee while reviewing documents for the 5th time. Marisa was resting. His daughter was still asleep. For a moment, he let his eyes linger on the peacefulness of that thought. They deserved safety. They deserved a quiet life. And if securing that meant waking up old instincts he'd hoped to retire, then so be it. He started with the neighbor closest to them, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hoyle, who had lived in the community longer than anyone. When he knocked, she answered almost immediately, as though expecting someone. Her voice trembled slightly. "Is this about her?" she asked, glancing around nervously. He nodded. "I'm gathering statements, only if you're comfortable." She hesitated, then stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. Her living room smelled of lavender and old books, the kind of place never meant for conflict. But conflict had found her anyway. She pulled out a small folder from a drawer, thin but organized. "She fined me for having a hazardous lawn ornament," she whispered. "It was a ceramic rabbit. My late husband bought it." He looked at the violation notice. It was absurd, vague, and backed by a bylaw number that didn't exist. "Did you ever challenge this?" "I tried. The board ignored me. After that, I stopped bothering." He scanned the document into his phone, thanked her gently, and stepped back outside with her troubled gaze following him. She wasn't just giving him evidence. She was giving him trust. Next was the Mitchell family, whose teenage son had been threatened with HOA penalties for leaving his bicycle near the porch. Penalties that tripled without explanation. Their frustration poured out quickly, years of resentment rising to the surface now that someone was finally listening. "We just paid because we were tired," Mr. Mitchell said, shaking his head. "She counts on people being tired." He documented everything: dates, letters, photos, receipts. The pattern kept widening, each thread tying Cynthia's behavior together. She didn't run an HOA, she ran a system of intimidation fueled by fear and silence. And for the first time, silence was breaking. By noon, he had 8 statements. By mid-afternoon, he had 12. Some were small violations. Some were financial discrepancies. One was a demeaning voicemail Cynthia left for a resident recovering from surgery, threatening daily penalties for overgrown bushes. Each story added another layer to her misuse of authority. But the final visit of the day brought something even more significant. He stopped by the Rodriguez household, a family who had kept mostly to themselves. Mr. Rodriguez answered the door slowly, studying him with cautious eyes. "You're the one whose wife was attacked," he said quietly. "Yes." Rodriguez stepped aside, letting him in. On the coffee table lay a stack of printouts, screenshots from HOA online portals, email exchanges, and digital receipts. "She charged me a late fee on a payment I made early," he explained. "When I asked for proof, she threatened to file a lien on my house." He examined the documents. The dates were clear. Payment submitted before the deadline. Cynthia had falsified the timestamp on her end. "Why didn't you push this?" he asked gently. Rodriguez sighed. "I have 2 jobs, 3 kids. I don't have time to fight her, and honestly, I thought no one would believe me." He nodded. That line had become familiar today. No one believed them. No one challenged her. But today, that was changing. He left with a full folder, nodding to the family as he walked down the steps. The weight of their relief settled heavily on him. These people had been living under someone who abused power with impunity, and now that he had stepped forward, they were surfacing years of fear, frustration, and humiliation. He drove back home as the sky darkened with early evening clouds. Marisa greeted him with a faint smile, her cheek still tender, though the swelling had softened. She saw the stack of folders in his hands and exhaled slowly. "That many?" "More will come," he said. She nodded. There was no surprise in her eyes, just understanding. She'd spent years reading people for a living when she was in the octagon. She knew what power looked like, and she knew when someone abused it. He spread the statements across the kitchen table. Each story added momentum to the case he was building. Each account validated the next, and each one, paired with the timestamps and fabricated invoices, made Cynthia's patterns not only visible, but undeniable. Marisa sat beside him, touching one of the highlighted pages. She never expected anyone to push back. He glanced at her. She hit the wrong family. His daughter peeked into the kitchen, sleepy and curious. "Dad, are you working on the lady who hurt Mom?" He knelt and pulled her close. "I'm working on making sure she can't hurt anyone else." Her small arms wrapped around his neck, and he held her tightly, feeling everything sharpen again. Purpose, clarity, resolve. When she went back to bed, he turned toward the documents. One more step now remained: organizing these testimonies into a documented pattern of misconduct that the prosecutor would be unable to ignore. Today was about witnesses. Tomorrow would be about structure. And once structure was built, exposure would be inevitable. Subscribe if you want to see how this battle unfolds. Trust me, justice isn't finished yet. He stayed at the kitchen table long after the rest of the house fell asleep, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet. The stack of witness statements beside him felt like a living thing, a unified voice of all the people Cynthia had pushed around, threatened and silenced. Now he needed to give that voice structure, order, weight. Because raw testimony wasn't enough. A prosecutor needed clarity, not chaos, and clarity was exactly what he specialized in. When morning light finally crept into the room, he stretched his stiff shoulders and opened his notebook. Today was about transforming scattered documents into a coherent case. The slap was the spark, but the rest, the false invoices, fabricated violations, predatory fines, that was the foundation. Together, they formed the kind of pattern even the most cautious prosecutor couldn't ignore. He started by sorting everything chronologically. The earliest complaint came from Mrs. Hoyle 3 years back. Then the Mitchells. Then Rodriguez. Then 6 more families. Each incident seemed isolated on the surface, but when combined, they formed a timeline of deliberate misuse of HOA authority. Cynthia didn't just bend rules, she used them as a weapon. He highlighted patterns, repeated threats, unauthorized fines, fabricated bylaw references, payments routed to a non-existent contractor, courthouse visits perfectly aligned with suspicious HOA filings. By midday, he had 3 folders: financial discrepancies, abuse of power complaints, and intimidation accounts. He labeled each clearly. Order mattered, presentation mattered. A case wasn't just evidence. It was how evidence spoke. Marisa walked into the kitchen, hair pulled back, looking steadier than yesterday. She scanned the folders with a mix of pride and heaviness. "You've done a lot," she murmured. He shook his head. "This is just the beginning." She sat across from him, running her fingers along the edge of the folder marked financial discrepancies. "You think it's enough?" "It's enough to get attention," he said, "but we need one more thing." "What?" "Confirmation." He opened his laptop and pulled up the county procurement database, a tool most residents never knew existed. It allowed anyone to cross-reference public vendor records. He typed in the name of the contractor that kept appearing in Cynthia's filings. No results. He checked again. Same outcome. Then he ran a larger search. The contractor didn't exist in the state or federal registry. It was a ghost entity, a mask someone used to funnel money without oversight. "This is your missing piece," Marisa said softly. He nodded. "Now I need formal proof." He grabbed his jacket and headed back toward the courthouse. Today wasn't about gathering stories. Today was about validating them. Inside the courthouse, he walked with the confidence of someone who belonged, because he did. Most staff saw him daily fixing office doors, adjusting thermostats, or unjamming printers. They knew him, they respected him, and that respect opened doors without him needing to force them. He found Jonah near the records desk, shuffling paperwork. The clerk looked up, surprised, but not startled. "You're back." "I need help," he said. "Just procedural access, nothing more." Jonah stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're filing something big, aren't you?" "Not yet, but soon." Jonah nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "I need confirmation of whether that contractor has ever submitted ID paperwork to the county for business filings. You don't need to give me anything restricted, just a yes or no." Jonah hesitated only briefly before checking the public database. His eyes scanned the screen, then narrowed. There's nothing here. No business license, no EIN, no tax ID. Nothing at all? Nothing. He exhaled through his nose. Exactly what he expected. But hearing it from a courthouse clerk gave the information official footing. Jonah printed the publicly accessible documentation summary and handed it to him. This is legal for you to have. It's just a verification of absence. That's all I need, he said. As he turned to leave, Jonah called after him. You know, people are talking, some of the staff who saw the slap, some who knew she was pushing her weight around for years. If you take this forward, you'll have support. He nodded. Support mattered, not emotionally, but strategically. Public exposure gained strength when witnesses voluntarily stepped into the light. Back home, he placed the verification document on the table, beside the evidence folders. It completed the financial picture. Every manipulated invoice now sat under the shadow of a non-existent contractor. Cynthia had created a funnel for money that didn't legally exist, and the alignment of dates proved it wasn't an accident. Marisa read through the document quietly. So, she was hiding it in plain sight. She wasn't hiding, he said. She just assumed no one would ever look. He opened his notebook again, flipping to a clean page. Next step is building the submission packet for the prosecutor. Marisa leaned back, watching him. You're really doing this. I'm not doing it for us, he said. I'm doing it for every person she scared into silence. His daughter peeked into the room, hesitant. Dad, are you still working on the lady? He nodded gently. Just making sure the truth is clear. She came closer and put a small hand on his arm. Good. She hurt Mom. He held her hand lightly. That was all the motivation he needed. When she returned to her toys, he turned back to the documents. The picture was complete, the case was taking shape, and the prosecutor wouldn't be able to ignore it once it hit their desk. Exposure was coming, not with noise, not with anger, but with evidence arranged too neatly to dismiss. And today had given him exactly what he needed, the final confirmation that Cynthia's empire was built on foundations ready to collapse. He closed the folder, feeling the shift inside him. This wasn't preparation anymore. This was the beginning of the confrontation. He sat with the completed folders spread across the table. The documents aligned with the precision of someone preparing for a briefing rather than a neighborhood dispute. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. This was no longer a quiet investigation. This was the beginning of formal action. He closed the last folder and rose, sliding everything into a plain black binder. It felt heavier than its actual weight, as though it carried every voice that had been ignored for years. Marisa watched him from the doorway, arms loosely folded, concern and certainty mixed in her eyes. You're taking it in today? He nodded. If I wait any longer, she'll twist the story. She's already trying. She crossed the room and rested a hand on his arm. Be careful. She's used to winning. He met her gaze. She's never gone up against a case built properly. Her soft exhale told him she trusted that answer. She didn't need the details. She understood him deeply enough to know when he was operating from instinct rather than anger. He left the house quietly, the binder tucked under his arm. The drive to the courthouse felt different this time. Not the return of old military adrenaline, but the cold clarity of purpose. He'd walked into countless rooms with this feeling, prepared to explain misconduct, connect dots others missed, and withstand the pushback of people who thought their status protected them. The courthouse had once been his battlefield. Now it was simply the place where truth waited to be filed. Inside, the lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm. Attorneys chatting near the elevators, clerks carrying stacks of files, the faint clink of keys from security. But he noticed something else, eyes turning toward him, not in judgment, recognition. The story of the slap had moved through the building faster than whispers should. He didn't slow down. He walked straight to the prosecutor's office. The receptionist glanced up when he approached. Can I help you? I need to submit a report regarding HOA misconduct and an assault that occurred yesterday. It includes evidence from multiple residents. Her eyes widened slightly at the mention of evidence. One moment. She disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she gestured toward a small office. Assistant Prosecutor Langford can speak with you." He thanked her and entered. Langford, a man in his early 40s with tired eyes and a desk stacked with folders, motioned for him to sit. "What do you have for me?" He placed the black binder on the desk. "A pattern of financial misconduct within our HOA, built over several years. Intimidation, fabricated violations, and what appears to be a shell contractor used to move funds without record, plus the footage request tied to the assault yesterday." Langford opened the binder slowly, scanning the first few pages. His eyebrows lifted in increments, first curiosity, then interest, then the unmistakable shift into seriousness. "You organized this chronologically?" "Yes." "And these residents gave written permission for their statements to be included?" "Yes." Langford flipped another page, then another. "This is thorough, very thorough. I didn't want there to be gaps." Langford leaned back in his chair. "You have more investigative experience than the average citizen." He didn't confirm anything. "I know how to document patterns." Langford studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good, because this," he tapped the binder, "is the kind of thing we can't ignore. I'll open a preliminary inquiry today." He exhaled quietly. The first door had opened. As he left the office, Jonah spotted him from down the hall. "Hey, did you file it?" "It's with Langford now." Jonah grinned in a way that held relief. "Good. People have been waiting for someone to take her on." He nodded once. "Now it's official." But the courthouse wasn't the only place where the tide had started shifting. When he stepped outside, he found Cynthia waiting near the public bench, arms crossed, her posture tense and coiled. She'd been expecting him, or maybe watching for any sign he'd take the morning incident further. Her expression was a tight mask of control, lips curled in irritation. "So, this is what you're doing now?" she snapped. "Dragging the whole community into your personal drama?" He paused on the steps. "This isn't personal, it's legal." Her nostrils flared. "You're blowing one misunderstanding out of proportion. And now you're spreading rumors about finances you don't understand." He stepped closer, calm but firm. "I filed evidence, not rumors." Her face reddened. "You think anyone will believe you over me?" "They already have." For the first time, a flicker of fear touched her eyes, quickly masked but unmistakable. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." He looked at her steadily. "Neither do you." She opened her mouth to retort, but he'd already turned away. He didn't need the last word. The binder on Langford's desk would speak for him far louder than anything he could say. Back home, he found Marisa sitting on the couch with a blanket over her lap, and their daughter curled beside her. The house felt warmer, steadier, anchored by the people he fought for. When he entered, Marisa sat up slightly. "How did it go?" "It's with the prosecutor now," he said quietly. "They're opening an inquiry." Her shoulders loosened in relief. "Then we wait?" He nodded. "We wait." But waiting didn't feel passive. It felt like the shift before a storm, the quiet moment where truth had already been spoken and consequences had begun moving. Outside, clouds gathered overhead, low and heavy, as though mirroring the weight pressing down on the community. The storm wasn't coming. The storm had already started, and Cynthia wasn't ready for how far the truth would spread. The storm cloud still hung low when he woke the next morning, the sky a heavy gray that seemed to press down on the neighborhood. There was no loud drama in the air, no shouts, no confrontation, only the quiet tension of a community beginning to realize something had shifted beneath their feet. He stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee, watching neighbors who usually avoided eye contact now glanced toward his house with something different in their expressions. Not pity, not fear, recognition. Someone had finally stood up to her. Inside, Marisa rested on the sofa with a blanket and her phone set aside, the swelling on her cheek nearly faded now. His daughter colored quietly beside her. The house felt steadier, as though the weight of waiting had settled into a rhythm rather than a storm. But he knew better. This calm was the breath before the next blow. Just before noon, his phone buzzed, a number he didn't recognize, but the area code matched the courthouse. He answered immediately. "Mr. Ward, this is Assistant Prosecutor Langford." The man's voice carried a controlled urgency. "I wanted you to know the inquiry has begun. We've scheduled an evidentiary hearing for next week, open to residents who wish to attend." He felt his pulse steady, not quicken. Understood. Langford continued, we'll be requesting the HOA's full financials for the last 3 years. Given what you submitted, we anticipate resistance from Ms. Renford. Of course she'd resist. That was predictable. Langford added, be prepared. When someone who's abused authority senses the walls closing, they tend to lash out. He already knew that too. I'll be ready. When the call ended, he set the phone down. Marisa watched him with the silent awareness of someone who had lived through her own fights, in cages under bright lights, beneath crowds chanting her name. She didn't need him to explain. She simply asked, It's happening? It's happening. She looked toward their daughter, then back at him. Then we move carefully. He nodded. Careful wasn't passive. Careful meant intentional. It meant controlled. It meant building the next step of the case long before Cynthia realized she was already losing ground. By afternoon, word of the upcoming hearing had spread through the neighborhood. One neighbor stopped him near the mailbox to say he'd be attending. Another said her brother-in-law worked in county auditing and had long suspected something was off with the HOA's filings. Then came a knock on the door. The Mitchells, holding a flash drive. We found old photos, Mr. Mitchell said. Stuff we didn't think mattered at the time, but it might help. He took the flash drive with gratitude. Every piece of evidence was a thread. Pull enough threads, and the whole fabric unraveled. Later in the day, as the sky darkened again, another layer of the victory strategy began its quiet shift. Exposure wasn't just about evidence. It was about momentum. And momentum arrived when neighbors started leaving their fear behind. Near sunset, a text from Jonah popped up. Heads up. Cynthia's been calling departments all day. She's trying to figure out what evidence we have. He wasn't surprised, but it confirmed the psychological shift. Cynthia was no longer attacking. She was searching, scrambling, anticipating an attack on her position. When someone wielded power through control, the moment they felt control slipping, panic replaced arrogance. He sent a quick reply. Thanks. Let me know if she tries anything else. Then he returned to the kitchen table and opened the binder. It wasn't time to rest. It was time to prepare the final arrangement of documents for the hearing. Everything had to be clear, concise, and airtight, the kind of structure a prosecutor could present without hesitation. Marisa came to sit across from him, watching the way he laid out pages with deliberate care. You're building this like you used to, she said quietly. He looked up. Old habits? Good ones, she murmured. The kind that get people like her held accountable. He didn't respond, but her words fueled him. The slap had been personal, but this case, it wasn't. This case was the sum of every person she'd pushed, silenced, or financially drained. He wasn't fighting for revenge. He was fighting for justice for people who never had the tools to fight for themselves. A soft knock interrupted them. When he opened the door, there stood Mr. Thornton, the elderly widower he'd spoken to days earlier. I'd like to come to the hearing, he said gently. Not to speak, just to be there. He nodded. That support carried weight. It meant the community was awakening. After Thornton left, he sat again with the binder and reviewed the timeline, ensuring every entry aligned perfectly. Repetition wasn't allowed. Vagueness wasn't allowed. His past training demanded precision. Dates, receipts, photographs, statements, timestamps. As he worked, he felt the familiar stillness settle inside. Not emptiness, but focus. The same stillness that came before entering a room to present findings, knowing the outcome depended on the strength of structure. That stillness meant he was ready. When he finally closed the binder, the sun had set, and the house had quieted for the night. He stood, stretched, and looked toward his sleeping daughter in the next room. He'd promised her safety. He'd promised stability. Now he was building the final steps to ensure it. He turned to Marisa. The hearing will be crowded, she nodded. Good, let them see. Let them see. Not him, not his wife, not his anger. Let them see her, the truth of what she'd done, the pattern she'd woven, the power she believed made her untouchable. The hearing wasn't the climax. It was the beginning of her public unraveling. And tomorrow, he'd start preparing for the moment every piece of evidence came under the courtroom lights. Subscribe with notifications on. The real fight is about to reach the public eye, and you won't want to miss how this unfolds. The house was quiet again the next morning, the kind of silence that comes before a shift in momentum. He stood in the doorway of his daughter's room for a moment, watching her sleep peacefully beneath her blanket, unaware of the storm gathering outside their world. That was the point. Children shouldn't feel the weight of corruption or fear. They should feel safety. And he intended to protect that with every step he'd take in the days ahead. When he entered the kitchen, Marisa was already awake, sitting upright with a mug between her hands. Her cheek had almost fully healed now, a faint shadow of what Cynthia had tried to turn into humiliation. But there was no humiliation in her posture, just strength, quiet, deliberate, unshakable. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. He didn't bother denying it. "There's too much to organize." She nodded, knowing better than anyone that preparation was the backbone of any fight worth taking on. She'd lived it inside an octagon, where strategy mattered as much as strength, and timing meant survival. But this wasn't her arena anymore. It was his. He sat across from her and opened the binder again. "Before the hearing, I want to make sure everything is in order. Every witness, every document, every discrepancy." Marisa exhaled. "People are talking. I've gotten messages from neighbors thanking us. Some sent screenshots of old HOA emails." His brows rose slightly. "More evidence?" She pushed her phone toward him. There were 6 new messages, each with attachments, photos of letters, screenshots of invoices, recordings of phone calls, all showing Cynthia's pattern of intimidation. With each message he opened, the picture sharpened further. "She made a lot of people suffer," Marisa murmured. "She relied on fear," he said, and silence. "But silence is breaking," she added. He nodded, feeling that truth settle deeper. Yes. Fear was shifting. People were stepping forward, and the more they stepped forward, the weaker Cynthia's grip became. Later that morning, he decided it was time to speak with someone who stood at the center of the community's simmering frustration. Mr. Keller, the former HOA treasurer. Keller had quit mysteriously a year ago and avoided neighborhood events since then. If anyone held critical information, it would be him. He walked across the neighborhood, binder tucked under his arm, until he reached Keller's modest brick house. He knocked gently. A moment later, the door cracked open, revealing a man in his 60s with deep lines on his forehead and wary eyes. "Keller," he greeted. "I wanted to talk if you're willing." Keller hesitated. "This about her?" "Yes." The man opened the door wider. "Come in." Inside, Keller's living room was dimly lit, stacks of unopened mail on the table, and a silence heavy enough to suggest the weight he'd been carrying alone. He sat on the worn couch and rubbed his hands together as if working up courage. "I heard about what happened at the courthouse," Keller began. "I'm sorry, she's done a lot of terrible things, but striking a pregnant woman, that's a line even she shouldn't have crossed." He took a seat opposite him. "You left the board without explanation. Why?" Keller swallowed hard, then nodded toward a drawer. "Open it." Inside the drawer lay a binder, older, worn, filled with handwritten notes and printed financial sheets, nearly identical to the one he had created. He lifted it gently. "She used me to sign off on things I didn't agree with," Keller said quietly. "When I pushed back, she threatened to sue me personally. I resigned instead, but I kept copies, just in case." He opened the binder and scanned the documents. There it was, the missing year of records that connected the older discrepancies to the newer ones. Payments authorized but never approved, notices altered, expenses categorized under false codes. It was a smoking gun. "Keller," he said, calmly, "this isn't just helpful. This completes the pattern." The older man lowered his head. "I always hoped someone would expose her. I didn't have the strength." "You do now," he said gently, "just by giving me this." Keller nodded slowly, relief softening his shoulders as though a burden he'd carried alone had finally shifted. Back home, he added Keller's binder to the growing case. Marisa watched as he arranged documents in perfect chronological order, tying older fraud to newer activity. The pattern was no longer suspicious. It was undeniable. "You're building a wall around her," Marisa said. "No," he replied. "I'm pulling the wall she built around herself apart." He spent the afternoon preparing witness lists and supplemental material for the prosecutor. Each piece strengthened the case. Each testimony exposed a new layer of Cynthia's abuse, and each new folder added weight to the truth. As evening fell, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet movement. People talked in driveways. Emails pinged in his inbox. Screenshots kept coming in. Even residents who barely knew him now reached out. Then came the message from Jonah. Hearing has been officially posted. Expect a crowd. Cynthia furious. He showed the message to Marissa, who shook her head with a knowing smirk. She's panicking. She should be. They sat together for a moment, the lamp casting a warm glow across the table. What happens at the hearing? She asked. They'll present the first round of evidence. Witnesses can attend. The judge will decide whether to move forward with a full investigation and audit. And you? I'll stand there with them, with everyone who couldn't stand before. Maritta's eyes softened. This isn't just justice for us. No, he whispered. It's justice for the whole community. He closed the binder one final time that night, feeling the shift, the preparation phase ending, the public phase beginning. Tomorrow, the neighborhood would be ready, and next week, the courthouse would be full. Cynthia would enter that hearing, thinking her status still shielded her. But what she didn't know was that every piece of evidence he'd gathered was already lined up to speak louder than she ever could. The morning of the hearing arrived with a cold, sharp wind that swept through the neighborhood, rattling branches and tapping loose shutters against houses. It felt fitting, a shift in the weather for a shift in power. He stood on the porch for a moment, buttoning his jacket, watching residents step out of their homes earlier than usual. Some carried folders, some walked in quiet groups, some lingered near their cars, exchanging tense glances. The community that had once moved silently under Cynthia's thumb was now moving with purpose. Inside, Marissa adjusted her coat, careful of her balance. She looked stronger today, her cheek almost fully healed. Their daughter tugged at her sleeve, asking if the hearing would fix the bad lady. Marissa knelt, smoothing the girl's hair, giving the kind of answer a child could hold on to without fear. Then she stood, squeezing his hand with a silent promise that they were ready. He placed the binder under his arm, the compiled truth of years of corruption, and guided his family to the car. The drive to the courthouse carried a quiet intensity, the kind that makes every passing streetlight feel like a countdown. When they arrived, the parking lot was already half full. Neighbors gathered near the entrance, speaking in low voices. Some nodded to him, some gave small gestures of gratitude. He nodded back, acknowledging each silently. Inside, the courthouse hummed with unusual energy. The hallway where Cynthia had slapped Marissa now held a crowd of people instead of shock. The same fluorescent lights flickered, but today they illuminated shifting loyalties instead of frozen fear. Jonah spotted him near the security station and walked over quickly. "She's already here," he murmured. "She brought an attorney and a PR consultant." Of course she did. He thanked Jonah and followed him toward the courtroom. Every step carried him closer to the public stage, the place where evidence would no longer live in folders or quiet offices, but be laid bare before the community she'd manipulated. When they entered the courtroom, the gallery was nearly full. Even court staff who weren't assigned to the hearing lingered near the back. People who had stayed silent for years now watched with a mixture of anticipation and relief. Marissa sat quietly beside him, hands resting over her stomach, embodying silent strength. And then Cynthia entered. She wore a crisp blazer and an expensive shade of navy, her hair perfectly styled, lips pressed in the firm line of someone who still believed their status could shield them. Her eyes scanned the room, expecting validation. Instead, she found a sea of faces turned toward her, with something closer to judgment. For the first time, her confidence wavered. The judge entered moments later. She was known for being decisive, fair, and allergic to theatrics. Exactly the kind of authority Cynthia had underestimated for years. Once seated, the judge reviewed the morning docket, then glanced toward the prosecutor's table. "Assistant Prosecutor Langford," she said, "you requested this evidentiary hearing?" "Yes, Your Honor." Langford stood, organizing his papers with quiet precision. "We have reason to believe there has been a long-term pattern of misconduct within the Brookline HOA, including financial irregularities and abuse of authority by its acting president." A faint ripple of movement passed through the gallery. "Additionally," Langford continued, "there is the matter of an assault that occurred in this courthouse, captured by security cameras." He didn't flinch, neither did Marissa. They watched, Cynthia's posture tighten, her jaw clench, her attorney lean in with a whispered attempt at control. The judge nodded. "Proceed with your first exhibit." Langford lifted a remote, The room dimmed, then the footage began. The slap replayed across the courtroom monitors, captured from the perfect angle, undeniable, unedited. The sound wasn't loud, but in the silence of the room, it struck harder than it had in the hallway. The image of Maurice's head turning, his daughter crying, and Cynthia stepping back without remorse drew a collective breath from the gallery. He didn't look at Cynthia, he watched the room instead. Shock, anger, recognition. Even people who had never met his family now understood exactly who she was. Not the respectable HOA president she pretended to be, but a woman whose entitlement had finally slipped into violence. When the footage ended, the judge spoke first. "Ms. Renford, do you wish to offer an explanation?" Cynthia's attorney rose quickly, voice strained. "Your Honor, this was an unfortunate accident." Langford cut in, voice steady. "Then let's discuss the pattern." He opened the binder he'd brought, the one built from every voice Cynthia had tried to silence. He handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel, then began the methodical presentation. Unauthorized fines, fabricated bylaws, threatening letters, intimidation of vulnerable residents, payments to a non-existent contractor, timestamp alignment of courthouse visits and fraudulent filings. Each item was presented clearly, no embellishments, no theatrics. Just truth, arranged with the precision of a man who once built cases with military exactness. He watched the judge as she reviewed the documents. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with each new page. Cynthia's breathing grew uneven. Her attorney's confidence dissolved into frantic page-turning. When Langford finished, the judge looked directly at Cynthia. "Ms. Renford, the evidence presented today indicates not only potential criminal misconduct, but a breach of public trust so severe it calls your entire tenure into question." The room held its breath. This was the beginning of the unraveling, the public exposure he'd been building toward since the day she slapped his wife. Cynthia opened her mouth to defend herself, but the judge raised a hand. "You will have your opportunity, but for now, effective immediately, you are suspended from all HOA duties pending a full forensic audit." A visible shock moved through the room. Neighbors exchanging glances, relief rippling through their posture. For the first time, Cynthia looked small, and he knew this was only the start. The judge's ruling hung in the air long after her gavel struck the block. The sound reverberated through the courtroom, not loud but final, the kind of sound that signals the beginning of consequences, not the end of them. Cynthia remained standing beside her, attorney as though rooted to the floor, shock freezing her polished composure. The room's attention shifted away from him and onto her, the first true fracture in the authority she'd wielded like a weapon for years. He didn't move, didn't celebrate, didn't smirk. He simply rested a steady hand on Maurice's shoulder as she exhaled slowly, the memory of the slap still living in the back of her eyes. Their daughter sat between them, clutching her mother's hand, but watching everything quietly, sensing the shift without understanding the complexity behind it. The judge adjusted her glasses and continued. "We will now proceed with reviewing supplemental evidence. Mr. Langford, present your next exhibit." Cynthia's attorney tried to regain control. "Your Honor, these accusations are exaggerated. My client has served this community faithfully." Langford opened the second folder. "Then the documents will show that, won't they?" The judge nodded. "Proceed." The binder opened again, this time to the older records from Keller, the missing year of HOA finances. Langford explained the discrepancies, charges without authorization, expenditures that did not match meeting minutes, the sudden appearance of a shell contractor receiving thousands of dollars in maintenance services that no one in the neighborhood had ever witnessed. Murmurs spread through the gallery. Residents leaned closer, whispering to each other. Names they recognized, dates they remembered, bills they had received. Cynthia's attorney began sweating, flipping documents as though searching for an escape. Meanwhile, Cynthia's expression changed, less defiant, more cornered. A predator discovering the cage around her had always been invisible until now. The judge's tone sharpened. "Ms. Renford, the evidence presented paints a deeply troubling picture. You will have the opportunity to defend each allegation during the audit. However, the preliminary findings justify immediate removal from decision-making power." Cynthia stepped forward abruptly, her voice cracking with desperate arrogance. "Your Honor, these people don't understand how much work I've put in. They're exaggerating minor errors." Langford set down one final document, the confirmation of the non-existent contractor, verified through public records. Minor errors don't involve paying thousands of dollars to a business that doesn't exist, he said flatly. Silence crashed over the room. He watched Cynthia's jaw tighten. She looked between the judge, the prosecutor, and the community behind her. A community she'd once controlled, now slipping out of her grasp. Her gaze finally landed on him, full of spite. "This is your doing," she hissed across the room. "You turned people against me." He didn't react. He didn't need to. The judge answered for him. "No, Ms. Renford," she said sternly. "Your actions turned people against you. A few." Neighbors lowered their eyes, overcome with emotion. Others exchanged affirming nods. The truth was no longer hidden, no longer whispered behind hedges or spoken in frustrated kitchen corners. It was out, visible, undeniable. The judge concluded the hearing with a final directive. A full forensic audit will begin immediately. The court will appoint an independent auditor, and all HOA accounts are frozen until completion. A temporary board will be formed, and Ms. Renford will remain under investigation for potential criminal charges. As the judge exited, people began rising from their seats with mixed emotions: relief, disbelief, something like collective healing after years of tension. He stayed seated, letting the room shift around him, grounding himself in the stillness that had carried him this far. Marissa finally spoke softly. "It's starting, isn't it? The real part." "The real part," he agreed. He helped her stand, keeping one arm around her shoulders for steadiness. Their daughter grabbed his hand immediately, feeling the change in the air. They stepped into the aisle together, walking through a crowd that parted quietly. On their way out, Mr. Keller stepped forward. "Thank you," he whispered, voice trembling slightly. "I should have done more years ago." "You did enough today," he replied. Then the Mitchells approached with careful smiles. Mrs. Hoyle waved timidly from a bench near the wall. Even strangers from the back of the room stopped them briefly to express gratitude. But not everyone stepped forward. Some residents lingered in corners, embarrassed they had stayed silent. He didn't judge them. Fear was a powerful force. Silence often grew from survival, not weakness. When they stepped into the hallway, the scene shifted again. Cynthia stood near a pillar, her attorney whispering urgently into her ear while she stared at the floor. For the first time, she didn't look like the woman who strutted through the community, handing out fines as if delivering justice. She looked small, diminished, unraveling. She lifted her head when she saw them approaching. Her mouth opened, maybe to threaten, maybe to justify, maybe to beg. But before she could speak, one of the bailiffs stepped between them, holding up a hand. "Ma'am, you need to stay clear of them." Cynthia's face crumpled, rage and humiliation mixing into something brittle. She turned away, gripping her attorney's arm for support as she was guided down the hallway. Marissa let out a slow exhale. She thought nothing could touch her? "She touched the wrong family," he answered quietly. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time that day, the wind calming into a gentle breeze. The crowd spilled out of the courthouse behind them, relieved, talking softly, processing what they had witnessed. He stood at the top of the steps, binder under his arm, his family beside him, knowing the victory wasn't over. An audit was coming. Criminal charges were possible, and he would stay vigilant until every part of her corruption was dismantled. Public exposure had begun. Poetic justice was just beginning its descent. He stood at the top of the courthouse steps with Marissa beside him and their daughter holding tightly to his hand. The wind had eased, the sun warming the concrete just enough to soften the weight of the morning. Behind them, the crowd slowly filtered out, neighbors murmuring, exchanging relieved glances, carrying the first sense of freedom they had felt in years. The binder under his arm felt lighter now, not because the work was finished, but because the truth had finally found daylight. Mara leaned gently into him, her breath steady for the first time since the slap. "It's strange," she murmured. "I feel like I can breathe again." He squeezed her hand. "You can. We all can." Their daughter tugged on his sleeve, pointing toward the courthouse doors, where a group of elderly neighbors were hugging each other, tears of relief in their eyes. She whispered, "Did we fix it?" He crouched down so he could meet her eyes directly. "We started fixing it," he said softly. "And sometimes that's everything. They walked toward the parking lot together, each step carrying a quiet finality. But as they approached the car, he noticed another figure stepping out from around the corner, Mr. Thornton, the widower with the ceramic rabbit violation. He approached slowly, clasping his hands nervously. "Mr. Ward," he said with a tremor, "I just wanted to say, thank you. I never imagined I'd live to see her held accountable." "You deserved better," he replied gently. "All of you did." Thornton nodded, emotion choking his words. "You gave us back our community." He didn't argue, he didn't deflect. Because today, that felt true. On the drive home, the neighborhood looked different, not physically. Same tidy lawns, same mailboxes, same trimmed hedges. But the atmosphere had shifted. The tension, the fear, the invisible grip Cynthia had held onto the streets had loosened. People walked slower, spoke easier, looked toward each other without suspicion. Exposure hadn't just targeted Cynthia, it had freed them all. When they parked in their driveway, Marisa touched his arm. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked, not fearfully, knowingly. "There's the audit," he said, "and the prosecutor will probably build a formal case. We'll have more hearings." She nodded, the understanding settling deeply. "And you'll walk into each one the same way you walked into this one. Only way forward," he said. Inside the house, their daughter ran to her room to play, leaving him and Marisa alone in the living room. She lowered herself carefully onto the couch and looked at him with a half smile. "You know, you never told me you still kept that investigative switch inside you." He chuckled, softly. "I hoped I'd never need it. But you did, and you used it the right way." He sat beside her, taking her hand. "I promised our daughter a safe life. I promised you peace. I wasn't going to let someone like her tear that apart." Marisa leaned her head on his shoulder. "She thought you were just a quiet maintenance tech." "She saw what she wanted to see," he said. "She never cared to look closer." Marisa's voice softened. "Most people never look close enough. You're good at hiding your strength. Sometimes that's the point." They sat in silence for a long moment, soaking in the quiet of a home no longer shadowed by HOA threats or fines or intimidation. Later that afternoon, as he sorted papers on the kitchen table, his phone buzzed again. A message from Jonah. Audit officially started. Renford furious, confiscated her office files. "You did it." He exhaled, a slow, steady release of tension. Not victory, not yet, but affirmation. The system had taken over, and now the truth was in motion. He stepped outside to breathe the cool air, notebook in hand. Not because he needed to write anything further, but because holding it reminded him of the journey, of how the very skills he tried to bury were the ones that ended up protecting his family. He flipped through the pages, seeing the timestamps, the testimony summaries, the discrepancies highlighted in bright ink. And for the first time, he closed the notebook fully with no lingering fear of what was left undone. Marisa joined him on the porch, wrapping an arm around his waist. "Feels like the end," she whispered. "It's the end of her power," he said, "and the beginning of our peace." Down the street, neighbors waved, openly, unafraid. A few approached to thank him personally, offering promises to support the audit, to volunteer for a new, interim board, to rebuild the community the way it should have been all along. For once, he didn't feel like the invisible maintenance worker in the background of courthouse halls. He felt seen, not for what he used to be, not for what he could do, but for who he chose to be. A father who protected his family, a husband who stood by his wife, a man who refused to let injustice go unanswered. As the sun set across the quiet street, he wrapped his arm around Marisa, whispering, "It's over." But she shook her head softly. "No," she said. "It's finally beginning." And he realized she was right. A new chapter had opened, one free from fear, one where truth had finally spoken loudly enough for everyone to hear. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. HOA Karen stole my baby from the hospital. What happened next? Will shock you, I'm the judge. Trust me, you'll feel it, and tell me in the comments. What injustice should we tackle next?